Hey guys, welcome to Psychology of Spirituality. Saeed here. I'm going to link a meditation video above. There's lots of stress and uncertainty, mental fatigue happening right now during this crisis, and I've been getting some good feedback from this meditation video. So I hope you guys will utilize that, bring some clarity, some clearance, some mindfulness into your life. So today, I've been at home doing lots of reading. One interesting book that I've been reading is Philip Zimbardo's The Lucifer Effect. I work with young people, I work with adolescents, and an interesting question that usually comes up during therapy is, are humans good or are humans evil? You'd be surprised how much that comes up, actually. At that age, there's lots of vulnerability, and adolescents are really starting to develop their philosophical worldview. So without getting too lost in the philosophical, theological, religious baggage that comes with that question, from a psychological standpoint, we each have the capability to be good or evil, some more than others due to environmental circumstances. Personality distribution is huge also, right? People who are a lot more aggressive in their nature tend to have more, ODD issues, more conduct disorder issues. Doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad person, though. Philip Zimbardo, you may know that name. I'm linking a video right here, a lecture that he did, a TED Talk lecture that he did on the Stanford prison experiment, which you may or may not be familiar with. They also made a movie about that, in which he took normal college students, put them into two randomized conditions. They were either going to play the role of a prisoner or a prison guard, and what he found was within a week that these seemingly normal individuals they weren't prisoners, they weren't prison guards. Completely, the role completely consumed them, to the point where he had to cancel the study due to emotional abuse. They were really, really abusing the prisoners. And Zimbardo also found himself getting so caught up in the study that all these ethical violations were lost on him. So in this book, he talks about some of the forces and some of the social resistances we can use to try to remain good people. So I thought that would be a really interesting video to do, the psychology of being a good person. And again, just from a mental standpoint, it's really important for us to take these things into considerations, because lots of the time we attribute evil behavior to personality deficits or, internal aspects of a person's character. The bad apples, that person's a bad apple. What Zimbardo talks about in this book are the systematic, the extraneous, the macro systematic forces which influence our behavior. So often what we see as evil behavior on part of an individual it's not because he or she is a bad apple. It's because of he calls it the bad barrel, right? The entire system is corrupt. So it's important for us to keep that in consideration. So number one, here's a Zimbardo strategy for being a good person. Number one, being able to recognize our faults and mistakes. So a healthy dose of self-awareness is always needed for us to navigate the complex and daunting environment that we find ourselves in. This means, first of all, acknowledging our mistakes, right? That's a huge one. Being able to learn from our mistakes. If we've slighted others, being able to apologize to them. And number four, being able to grow from our mistakes. So lots of the times we ruminate about the mistakes that we've done. That's not learning from it. It's actually crippling us. A person who's able to grow from it, that mistake needed to happen for me to find growth. That's really important. So, Zimbardo talks about the Iraq War, the Vietnam War, all of these mistakes that were happening that administrators, that government officials were blind to see, and it put us in these never-ending wars that led to the death of millions of people. So that's number one, being able to recognize our faults. Number two, being mindful. That comes of no surprise. I'm going to link some mindfulness videos in the description below. Because for you guys who may not know, I work at a mindfulness research lab. But this is important, right? Lots of the time we live on autopilot. And that's not a conscious choice. That's an adaptive mechanism. Constantly using emotional cognitive resources expands energy. So lots of the times we're just operating on schemas and on mental heuristics, which just means shortcuts to try and lessen energy, right? Which means that it's even more important that we be mindful, right? So this is the foundation for forming critical thinking, right? Because if we rely on old habitual patterns, on old ways of doing things, it's going to lead to the same old scenarios and the same old outcomes. For mindful behaviors, journaling, meditation, spirituality is huge, very important. And I'm linking a meditation video above to get you started on your journey. So that's number 2, being mindful. Number 3, being able to take responsibility. So conformity, Zimbardo talks a lot about conformity. This was the justification that the Nazis used during the Nuremberg trials, right? We were only following orders. So group norms and social influences often paint the behavior we produce, even if it's unfamiliar to us. So being responsible means we become resistant to social influences by maintaining a sense of integrity and by maintaining our set of values. My parents always used to say, act like somebody is watching you, or act like God is watching you. So that's a guiding principle that we can always use, and that'll help maintain our sense of responsibility in situations where we often just refer to an authority figure, even if that person is asking things of us that we would say no to in other circumstances. So that's very important. Be responsible. Number 3, being resolute in who we are and recognizing the humanity of others. So Zimbardo speaks a lot about de-individualization, it's a hard word to say, which leads to dehumanization, right? Which leads to atrocities being committed by every normal day people. So we think of, the Rwandan genocide, we think of terrorists, we think of the Nazis as monsters. No, they were actually normal people. Through a process, we're able to dehumanize others. So to prevent this, we should take time in our day to recognize the humanity in others, this is critical because we are biased by an in-group, out-group phenomena. And here's a link to a video describing the in-group, out-group phenomena. So we need to practice these skills. Looking at people in the eye, asking them how their day is going. Being genuine when you do that, right? These are things that sometimes we see as annoyances, but they're the foundation for living in a compassionate society. So that's number 4, being resolute who we are and recognizing humanity in others. Number 5, so now we're getting more into the systematic forces that we have to resist. Understanding different frames of information. So framing is very important. Zimbardo uses this example from social research. Most people, if they're presented with this, they'll give 2 different answers. Most people would not vote if there's a 40% chance of losing something. They would not vote, but they would vote if there's a 60% chance of winning the same thing. So that's called framing, right? So the way something is framed produces different results from our behavior. So the way complex issues and social situations are framed are important to understand because they are used by almost every company, institution, logo, merchandising, branding, commercials, advertisement to influence our behavior, right? Different framing. So we need to be conscious and vigilant towards unjust forces that want to influence our state of mind, right? So this is coming from a more individual level to a more systematic level. Understanding this and asking questions is one of the best ways to do it. Lots of the times we're kind of just, like I said, we're on autopilot, so we're not able to even retain lots of the information. But if we're mindful, if we're resolute in who we are, these steps will come in order. So that's number 5. Number 6, understanding time perspective. So there's a really famous social psychology experiment called the marshmallow experiment, which I'm linking right here, and it's been produced consistently, which means that it's pretty reputable, in which people are asked whether children are asked whether they receive a marshmallow right now or receive 5 marshmallows at the end of an hour, or something along those lines, and they've used different variables to try to find the same thing, that most humans opt for the short-term benefits, even if it produces long-term disadvantages, right? So we need to engage in a cost-benefit analysis all the time, recognizing our past, our present, and our future. That's very, very, very critical. And again, it's important to understand that these are conscious skills that we need to develop over time. They don't come easy, right? Our old way of doing things will lead us to utilizing the short-term benefits. So we need to kind of expand that, by using different resources, critical thinking, mindfulness, self-awareness, spirituality, things that will help equip us with mental capabilities, so we're able to recognize these things in our environment. If not, we're going to be the product of easy influence from larger forces. So that's number 6, understanding time perspective. Number 7, the need for security versus loss of personal freedom. So human beings, it's been found, can easily be manipulated into committing some pretty atrocious acts if they feel like their personal well-being, their personal livelihood is at stake. I mean, this is the foundation for going to war, right? Those people over there are a threat to you, so we need to take away some rights, the Patriot Act, a loss of privacy, a loss of security, and it will ensure the betterment of you and your society and your family, right? So we're like, oh yeah, I agree to this, right? As long as I'm safe, right? But lots of the times, it's not worth it, The loss of our basic freedoms now is not worth some vague, distant illusion of security in the future, right? So again, that cost-benefit analysis that I was talking about, right? Short-term benefits. Yeah, I'll give up my freedom right now. We're not thinking about the future. But, I mean, if we're applying that same predicament to our modern world, the Patriot Act, the loss of our security, the loss of our privacy, I mean, has that produced a more safe future? I mean, there's research that's been done that would say no, right? So we're dealing with the ramifications of the things that we signed up for almost 20 years ago. So it's important that we be vigilant about that. Never ever sacrifice who we are, our basic humanity, for the need for some vague security. Okay, that's very important. Last but not least, recognizing that our behavior and our individual selves are part of a global system. So going back to that philosophical question, are we good humans? I think the framing of that question is entirely wrong. We don't act in separate vacuums from one another. Good, evil, right? We're part of a complex system that has immense pressure on us. The way we behave at a heavy metal concert, for example, is entirely different from the way we behave at a church or a mosque or with our family during Thanksgiving dinner, for some people. And that's due to situational norms, right? That's due to what society has set the expectations for those two different environments. So that is entrenched in a wider system of the societal expectations and norms, which is entrenched in the state that we live in, which is entrenched in the country, which in of itself is entrenched in the time period that we find ourselves in, right? So the norms of today, dressing, speaking, is different from what it was 50 years ago, and it will be different from what it is 50 years ago, 50 years from now, right? So that's Brofenberner's model, which I'm putting right here. And we can even apply this to our understanding of mental health. Lots of the time when we think about mental illness, we attribute it to a person's fault, right? That illness exists within that person. We don't consider the environmental influences that may trigger illness, or that may be the catalyst for a large part of a person's mental health illness. So we need to understand the environmental, the systematic, the macrosystematic, the chronosystematic influences that influence even our behavior, right? So those are 8 of Zimbardo's techniques for maintaining a sense of responsibility, maintaining our civic virtue, and maintaining the goodness that I believe that each of us is capable of. The last thing I want to say is recognizing our own humanity. Lots of the time during therapy, people will say things like, humans are so annoying, why are people always like this? Why are people so mean? They use these different terms. And that really begs the question, aren't you a human too? Right? So, this is called humility. And developing a spiritual worldview, developing a spiritual self is one of the best ways to combat this and to equip ourselves with cautious humility, which is one of the best ways of just living that you can do. So I'm going to link a video right here speaking about my mindful and spiritual journey, and I hope that you guys can learn from that, and I hope we can all learn from each other. So that's the psychology of being a good person. Leave a comment, hit the thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on next week's episode. Thank you.